They say genius dies twice. Once when the heart stops beating, and again when the world forgets. But what happens when a genius is forgotten while still alive? Imagine dying alone in a cold room, your life's work dismissed as stolen, your decades of service rewarded with abandonment, your funeral attended by no one of importance. And then imagine that 3 centuries later, the world discovers you were right about everything. This is not fiction. This is the story of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and it will break your heart. November 14th, 1716, Hanover, Germany. In a modest set of rooms cluttered with papers, books, and half-finished manuscripts, a 70-year-old man lies dying. His name is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, and he is completely alone. His legs are grotesquely swollen with gout, the pain so intense that he hasn't been able to walk properly in years. His eyes, weakened by decades of reading by candlelight, can barely focus. His secretary sits nearby, the only human witness to the final moments of one of history's greatest minds. Outside, the city of Hanover continues its daily business, utterly indifferent to the fact that a giant is falling. When they finally bury him days later, no representatives from the court attend, no professors from the university, no members of the scientific academies that had once celebrated his membership, just a handful of people standing around a grave that won't even receive a headstone for years. The Royal Society of London, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, of which Leibniz had been a fellow for decades, doesn't even mention his death in its official proceedings. It's as if they're actively trying to erase him from existence. How? How does this happen? How does a man who invented binary arithmetic, the foundation of every computer you've ever used, die unmourned? How does the philosopher who wrestled with the deepest questions of existence, who revolutionized logic, who laid groundwork that wouldn't be fully understood for centuries, how does such a man become invisible? And most painfully, how does the co-inventor of calculus, whose mathematical notation you learned in school, whose symbols are written on blackboards around the world every single day, how does he die branded as a plagiarist and a fraud? This isn't just a story about genius. It's a story about what we do to genius when it threatens us, when it challenges us, when it refuses to fit into the neat boxes we've prepared for it. It's about betrayal, jealousy, political machinations, and the casual cruelty of powerful men. And it starts not with triumph, but with loss. Leipzig, 1652. Young Gottfried is 6 years old when his father dies. Friedrich Leibniz had been a professor of moral philosophy at the university, a man of learning and books, and his death shatters the small world of his son. But here's where something remarkable happens, something that tells us everything we need to know about who Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz would become. While other children might have withdrawn into grief or acted out in anger, 6-year-old Gottfried found his solace in his father's library. Picture it, a small boy, barely tall enough to reach the lower shelves, pushing open the heavy door to his late father's study. The room smells of leather bindings and aging paper. Shelves climb to the ceiling, packed with volumes in Latin, Greek, German, works of ancient philosophy, theology, history, poetry, the accumulated wisdom of centuries, overwhelming even for an adult scholar. The family, well-meaning but worried, wanted to lock the library away. The boy was too young, they said. These books were too advanced. They would confuse him, frustrate him, perhaps even damage his developing mind. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. Gottfried begged for access to the library. He pleaded with a passion that surprised everyone. Something in those books called to him, promised him something he desperately needed, not just knowledge, but connection to the father he'd lost. Finally, they relented. The door was opened, and what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. By the age of 8, 8 years old, Gottfried had taught himself Latin. Not simple Latin, not just basic grammar and vocabulary, but sophisticated literary Latin that would have impressed university students. How did he do it? Through pure determination and an intuitive grasp of linguistic patterns that suggested his mind worked differently from others. He would later say that he discovered the principles of Latin grammar by comparing translations with their originals, by identifying patterns, by treating language itself as a puzzle to be solved through logic. By 12, he had devoured virtually every book in that library: philosophy, theology, history, mathematics. He consumed it all with a hunger that never abated. But this wasn't just memorization or showing off precocity. Even as a child, Leibniz was searching for something deeper, the underlying patterns that connected different fields of knowledge, the fundamental principles that could unite human understanding. He was already dreaming of what he would later call the characteristica universalis, a universal logical language that could express all human thought. Think about what this means. Think about the loneliness. While other 12-year-old boys were playing games and getting into mischief, Gottfried was grappling with Aristotle's metaphysics and debating with himself about the nature of substance and reality. Who could he talk to? Who could possibly understand what was happening inside that extraordinary mind? His mother loved him, but couldn't comprehend his intellectual needs. His teachers at school found him intimidating, a student who had already surpassed them in many areas. His classmates thought him strange, distant, obsessed with dusty books and abstract ideas. Genius, especially in childhood, is often less a gift than a curse. It isolates. It creates a gulf between the exceptional individual and everyone else. Young Gottfried learned early that his mind was both his greatest treasure and his loneliest burden. At 14, he enrolled at the University of Leipzig. 14! But even university disappointed him almost immediately. The professors there were teaching an ossified curriculum that hadn't changed substantially in a century. They lectured on Aristotelian philosophy as if Galileo hadn't looked through a telescope, as if Descartes hadn't written a word, as if the entire scientific revolution sweeping through Europe simply didn't exist. They were teaching the past, and Leibniz had already moved beyond it. But Leibniz was also strategic. He didn't openly rebel. Instead, he absorbed what the university offered while secretly educating himself in the modern philosophy and science that truly interested him. He read Bacon, Galileo, Descartes, Hobbes, Gassendi. He studied the new mechanical philosophy that was replacing Aristotelian scholasticism. He taught himself mathematics, going far beyond anything in the curriculum. And he began to develop his own ideas, synthesizing ancient and modern thought in ways no one had attempted before. By the time he was 20, Leibniz had completed his studies and was ready for his doctorate in law. This should have been straightforward. He was brilliant, had completed all requirements, and had written a dissertation that was clearly the work of a formidable legal and philosophical mind. But Leipzig rejected his application for the doctorate. The official reason: he was too young. 20 years old was simply too young for such an advanced degree, they said. But we know what was really happening. Leibniz was threatening. His intellect made smaller minds uncomfortable. His dissertation was too innovative, too challenging to traditional interpretations. He asked questions that his examiners couldn't answer. And so they did what mediocrities always do when confronted with excellence that surpasses their understanding. They found an excuse to reject it. The pain of this rejection must have been profound. This was his hometown university, where his father had taught. These were professors who should have celebrated having such an exceptional student. Instead, they humiliated him. They told him, essentially, that he didn't belong. Leibniz left Leipzig. He traveled to the University of Altdorf near Nuremberg and submitted the same dissertation. Altdorf wasn't as prestigious as Leipzig, but they recognized quality when they saw it. They granted him his doctorate immediately, and even offered him a professorship. At 20 years old, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz could have settled into comfortable academic life, teaching and writing, secure in the respect of colleagues and the admiration of students. He turned it down. Why? Because Leibniz didn't want comfort. He didn't want the narrow confines of academic life in a provincial German university. His ambition was larger, his vision more expansive. He wanted to engage with the great minds of Europe. He wanted to influence politics, to contribute to the practical improvement of society, to participate in the grand intellectual project of understanding everything. The university, he felt, would have been a prison for such dreams.
So instead, he entered the service of the Elector of Mainz, one of the most powerful princes in the Holy Roman Empire. This was 1667, and Leibniz was stepping into a world of diplomacy, politics, and courtly intrigue that would shape the rest of his life, and ultimately contribute to his tragedy. His position involved legal and political work, but Leibniz being Leibniz, he couldn't restrict himself to his official duties. He wrote treatises on law, on politics, on theology. He proposed schemes for everything from reforming the legal code to reuniting the Christian churches. His mind was always racing ahead, always seeing possibilities that others missed, always generating ideas faster than he could possibly implement them. And then, in 1672, everything changed. Leibniz was sent to Paris on a diplomatic mission. Paris, the intellectual capital of Europe, the city of light and enlightenment, where the greatest philosophers and scientists gathered in salons and academies, where ideas were currency and innovation was celebrated. For a young man from provincial Germany who had felt intellectually starved his entire life, arriving in Paris must have been like a pilgrim reaching Mecca. In Paris, Leibniz bloomed. He met Christian Huygens, perhaps the greatest mathematician and physicist of the age after Newton, who became his mentor and friend. He attended meetings of the Academy of Sciences. He discussed philosophy with Antoine Arnaud and Nicolas Malebranche. He examined Pascal's calculating machine and began thinking about mechanical computation. He was finally among people who could understand him, who could challenge him, who could appreciate the scope of his genius. And it was here, in this atmosphere of intellectual ferment, that Leibniz threw himself into mathematics with an intensity that would produce one of the greatest achievements in human history. The mathematics Leibniz had learned as a student was respectable, but not cutting edge. He knew Euclidean geometry, basic algebra, some of the new analytic geometry developed by Descartes. But working with Huygens, he quickly realized how much he didn't know, and he set about learning it with the same voracious appetite he'd shown as a child in his father's library. What Leibniz was working toward, though he didn't fully realize it at first, was a way to deal with change, with motion, with quantities that varied continuously. The mathematics of his time was excellent for dealing with static situations, the geometry of fixed figures, the algebra of constant quantities. But the world wasn't static. Planets moved, objects fell, curves curved, and the mathematical tools available were clumsy for analyzing these dynamic situations. Between 1673 and 1676, Leibniz developed an entirely new form of mathematics. He called it the calculus differentialis and calculus summatorius, the differential calculus and the integral calculus. What he'd created was a systematic method for dealing with infinitesimal changes, a way to calculate rates of change and areas under curves with unprecedented precision and generality. But here's what made Leibniz's achievement truly revolutionary. It wasn't just the mathematics itself, but the notation he invented to express it. Leibniz had an almost supernatural gift for creating symbols that didn't just represent mathematical ideas, but actually embodied them, made them thinkable in new ways. His notation for calculus was so perfect, so intuitive, so revelatory of the underlying structure of the mathematics that it's still used unchanged today, more than 3 centuries later.
Think about that for a moment. When you learned calculus in school, when you wrote dx or drew that elongated s for an integral, you were using Leibniz's notation. The symbols that made calculus accessible to millions of students, that made it possible to solve problems in physics and engineering and economics, those symbols came from the mind of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, working in Paris in the 1670s. He was 28 years old and had just changed mathematics forever. He knew it too. He could feel the power of what he'd created. This wasn't just a technical advance, it was a new language for describing reality itself. With calculus, you could analyze motion, calculate velocities and accelerations, find maxima and minima, determine areas and volumes of the most complex shapes. You could, quite literally, mathematize the world in ways that had been impossible before. Leibniz was at the peak of his powers, surrounded by brilliant colleagues who recognized his achievement, living in the most exciting city in Europe. His future seemed unlimited. Surely, he thought, surely one of the great scientific academies would offer them a position. Surely Paris would want to keep him. Surely the patrons who supported science and philosophy would compete to support his research. And then, in 1676, the trap snapped shut. The Elector of Mainz, Leibniz's patron, died. With him died Leibniz's funding and his official position. Suddenly, Leibniz needed a job. He desperately sought positions in Paris, positions that would allow him to continue his mathematical and philosophical work. He wrote letters. He called in every connection he had. The responses were polite but non-committal. Possibilities were mentioned, but nothing concrete materialized. Meanwhile, an offer came from Duke John Friedrich of Brunswick-Lüneburg, ruler of Hanover. The position? Court librarian and counselor. The duties? Managing the ducal library, providing legal and political advice, and, here was the poison pill, writing a detailed genealogical history of the House of Brunswick to support their territorial and political claims. Leibniz looked at this offer with horror. Hanover was a backwater, a provincial court with none of Paris's intellectual vitality. The ducal library was respectable, but nothing special. And genealogical research, tracing family trees through dusty archives, this was work for a clerk, not for the man who just invented calculus. But what choice did he have? He needed employment. He needed security. And underneath it all was a hope. Surely this would be temporary. Surely he could complete the genealogical project quickly, then return to Paris or secure a position at a major university. This was just a detour, he told himself, just a brief interlude before getting back to his real work. In late 1676, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz reluctantly left Paris and traveled to Hanover. He thought he was accepting a temporary position. What he actually did was enter a gilded cage from which he would never escape. Those 40 years he would spend in Hanover, 40 years, were the tragedy that defines his life. Imagine it. Imagine being Mozart forced to spend 40 years composing nothing but church hymns for a small-town chapel. Imagine being Einstein stuck teaching basic arithmetic to indistrusted schoolchildren. Imagine having one of the most powerful minds in human history and being required to spend decades researching whether some minor nobleman was truly descended from some other minor nobleman 4 centuries earlier. This was Leibniz's reality. The genealogical project that he'd thought would take a few years consumed decade after decade. The dukes who employed him cared desperately for proving their royal lineage. It was essential for their political ambitions, and they pushed Leibniz relentlessly to complete it. Meanwhile, Leibniz tried desperately to maintain his real intellectual work around the edges of these official duties. And here's what makes his situation even more heartbreaking. He succeeded. Even trapped in Hanover, even burdened with mind-numbing genealogical research, even increasingly isolated from the intellectual centers of Europe, Leibniz continued to produce work of staggering genius. In 1679, he perfected his system of binary arithmetic, representing all numbers using only ones and zeros. He realized that this system was ideal for mechanical calculation and even designed mechanical calculating machines that could perform addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division automatically.
He understood 3 centuries before the digital age that binary was the key to mechanical thinking. When you use your phone, your computer, when you stream this video, you're using Leibniz's invention. The digital revolution has its roots in the work he did in provincial Hanover in the 1680s. He developed his mature philosophical system, arguing that reality consisted of infinite monads, simple substances that were the ultimate units of existence, each reflecting the entire universe from its own perspective. This metaphysics was breathtakingly original, attempting to reconcile the mechanical philosophy of Descartes with traditional Christian theology, to find a middle path between pure materialism and pure idealism. He wrote the Theodicy, wrestling with the problem of evil. How can a good and all-powerful God allow suffering in the world? His answer, that we live in the best of possible worlds, wasn't naive optimism, but a sophisticated argument about the nature of possibility and divine choice.
He made discoveries in physics, correctly identifying the concept of kinetic energy as the quantity conserved in collisions, contrary to Descartes' view. He worked in geology, proposing that the Earth had a molten core and that its surface had been shaped by both fire and water over immense periods. He studied linguistics, collecting vocabularies from different languages and trying to trace their historical relationships. He laid groundwork for what would become topology. He corresponded with over 600 intellectuals across Europe, philosophers, mathematicians, scientists, theologians, maintaining vast networks of knowledge exchange that spanned the continent. All of this while stuck in Hanover, fulfilling duties he found tedious, serving dukes who cared more about courtly ceremony than scientific discovery. But you can feel the loneliness seeping through his letters from this period. He writes to his correspondents in Paris, in London, in Amsterdam, and you can sense his desperate hunger for intellectual companionship, for someone to truly understand his ideas. He shares his mathematical discoveries, his philosophical insights, hoping for engagement, for criticism, for dialogue. Sometimes he gets it. More often, his letters go unanswered or receive perfunctory replies. The world is moving on, and Leibniz, trapped in Hanover, is being left behind. And then, just when it seemed his situation couldn't become worse, disaster struck in the form of a question that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Who really invented calculus? Remember, Leibniz had developed his calculus in the early to mid-1670s. He'd shared it with other mathematicians through letters and conversations, but he'd been slow to publish formally. He was a perfectionist, always refining, always improving. His first published paper on the differential calculus appeared in 1684 in the Acta Eruditorum, a German scientific journal. It was elegant, clear, and revolutionary, introducing the notation that would become standard. What Leibniz didn't fully appreciate was that across the English Channel, another genius had been working along similar lines, but in almost complete secrecy. Isaac Newton. The name still resonates across the centuries. Newton was, by any measure, one of the greatest scientific minds who ever lived. His Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, had laid out the mathematical laws governing celestial and terrestrial motion, creating modern physics essentially from scratch. He had discovered the spectrum of light, developed the theory of gravitation, and made contributions to optics that wouldn't be surpassed for a century. He was brilliant, meticulous, and, as it would turn out, paranoid, secretive, and vindictive. Isaac Newton had developed his own version of calculus, what he called the method of fluxions, back in the 1660s during the plague years when Cambridge University was closed and he'd retreated to his family's farm. But Newton, pathologically afraid of criticism and controversy, had shared this work with almost no one. He'd circulated it among a tiny circle of friends, but he hadn't published. For 20 years, Newton sat on one of the most important mathematical discoveries in history, keeping it essentially secret. By the time Leibniz published his calculus papers in the 1880s, Newton had been sitting on his method for 2 decades, and when Newton's followers saw Leibniz's work, their immediate reaction was suspicion. That German, they said, must have somehow gotten hold of Newton's unpublished work and stolen it. Never mind that Leibniz's approach was different. Never mind that his notation bore no resemblance to Newton's. Never mind that Leibniz had actually published first. Newton was English, he was already famous, and England's scientific establishment was prepared to defend him against any challenger. At first, the controversy simmered quietly. A few English mathematicians made pointed remarks. Some letters were exchanged. Leibniz, confident in the originality of his work, didn't take it too seriously. He knew he'd developed calculus independently. He had his notes, his correspondence, his publications. Surely, he thought, the matter would resolve itself. He had no idea what was coming. The accusations intensified. In 1699, a Swiss mathematician named Fatio de Doulier, a former friend of Leibniz's who'd become Newton's protégé, publicly accused Leibniz of plagiarism. The claim was stark. Newton had invented calculus, Leibniz had stolen it, and Leibniz's published work was fraudulent. The charges were published, circulated, discussed in scientific circles across Europe. Leibniz was stunned. This wasn't gentle academic disagreement. This was a direct attack on his honor, his integrity, his reputation. In the intellectual world of the 17th and 18th centuries, being labeled a plagiarist meant you were a liar, a thief, someone who stole other people's ideas and passed them off as your own. It was a charge that could destroy a lifetime's worth of work and respect. He defended himself with careful, detailed rebuttals. He pointed out that he'd developed his calculus independently, using different methods and arriving at different notation. He noted that Newton had never published his method, had kept it secret for decades. How could he have stolen something that wasn't publicly available? He emphasized that mathematical discoveries often happened independently, that two people working on similar problems could arrive at similar solutions without either copying from the other. His arguments were logical, well-reasoned, backed by evidence. They should have been convincing. But this was never about logic or evidence. This was about nationalism, institutional power, and the fragile ego of Isaac Newton. In 1712, the controversy reached its crisis. The Royal Society of London, the most prestigious scientific institution in England, of which both Newton and Leibniz were fellows, agreed to investigate the priority dispute and determine who had invented calculus first. This should have been a fair hearing, an objective examination of the evidence by neutral experts. It was anything but. The committee appointed to investigate was stacked with Newton's allies. Worse, Newton himself, who by this time was president of the Royal Society, secretly controlled the entire process. Documents that later came to light revealed the shocking truth. Newton had actually written the committee's final report himself, then published it under the Royal Society's authority, making it appear to be an objective judgment by neutral experts. Think about that. The judge in the case had secretly written the verdict against his opponent, then passed it off as an impartial ruling by a committee of experts. It's difficult to conceive of a more egregious corruption of the scientific process. The report, published as the Commercientum Epistolicum, declared unequivocally that Newton was the sole true inventor of calculus, and Leibniz had plagiarized his work. The Royal Society's imprimatur gave this verdict institutional authority. It was disseminated across Europe, translated, discussed, cited as definitive proof of Leibniz's intellectual theft. The impact on Leibniz was devastating. Imagine spending your entire adult life building a reputation through genuine achievement, through actual discoveries and innovations, through helping and teaching others, and then watching that reputation crumble under a flood of slander and lies backed by the most powerful scientific institution in the world. Leibniz knew he was innocent. He knew he'd developed calculus independently. But how do you prove your innocence when the institution claiming to judge you fairly has already decided your guilt? He fought back as best he could. He wrote rebuttals, published counter-arguments, appealed to mathematicians on the continent to examine the evidence fairly. Some supported him. The Bernoulli brothers, Johann and Jakob, prominent mathematicians in Switzerland, vouched for the originality of his work. Continental mathematicians continued using Leibniz's notation because it was simply superior to Newton's fluxions. But many others stayed silent, unwilling to anger the powerful Newton and the English scientific establishment. The stress was enormous. Leibniz had always been energetic despite his sedentary lifestyle, always able to work long hours fueled by intellectual passion. But now, in his 60s, his health began to fail. Gout, that painful inflammation of the joints that was the curse of the sedentary scholar, attacked him with increasing severity. His legs swelled, walking became difficult, then agonizing. The pain was constant, interfering with sleep, with work, with everything. But he couldn't rest. He had to defend himself. He had to complete the endless genealogical project for his ducal patrons. He had to maintain his correspondence, because if he lost connection with the intellectual networks of Europe, he would disappear entirely. He was fighting on multiple fronts, against Newton's accusations, against his failing body, against the isolation and neglect of his position in Hanover, and he was losing.
His letters from this period are heartbreaking. The loneliness bleeds through every line. He writes to correspondents who don't write back. He sends copies of his work to people who acknowledge them with brief, perfunctory notes. He can feel himself being forgotten, feel his place in the intellectual world slipping away, and there's nothing he can do to stop it. And then came the final, unbearable betrayal. In 1714, Leibniz's employer, Georg Ludwig, Elector of Hanover, became King George I of England. This succession had been decades in the making, carefully orchestrated through political maneuvering and the genealogical work that Leibniz himself had contributed to. When the last Stuart monarch, Queen Anne, died without a Protestant heir, the throne passed to the House of Hanover, and Georg Ludwig became the first Hanoverian king of England. For Leibniz, this should have been his moment of triumph. He had spent 40 years in Hanover's service. He had worked on the very genealogical research that established the House of Hanover's claim to the English throne. Surely King George would bring his faithful servant to London. Surely there would be honors, recognition, perhaps even a position at the Royal Society, or a royal pension that would finally free him from the tedious duties that had consumed so much of his time. George I left for London without him. Let that sink in. The man who had spent 4 decades serving the House of Hanover, who had sacrificed his intellectual career to write their genealogy, who had been loyal through everything, he was left behind in Hanover like an old piece of furniture too shabby to display in the new palace. Why? Because bringing Leibniz to London would have been politically awkward. Newton was there, president of the Royal Society, a national hero. The calculus controversy was still fresh. Having Leibniz at court would have created embarrassment, reopened wounds, caused uncomfortable questions. It was simply easier to leave him behind. The cruelty is almost incomprehensible. Georg Ludwig, King George I, didn't even have the decency to tell Leibniz directly. Leibniz learned of his abandonment through the silence, through the absence of any invitation, through the realization that the king had departed for his new kingdom, and Leibniz wasn't coming. The letters Leibniz wrote in the final 2 years of his life are almost too painful to read. He begs, there's no other word for it, he begs for some recognition, some acknowledgement of his service. He asks permission to come to London to complete research for the genealogical history in English archives. Permission is denied. He asks for a small pension increase to help with his medical expenses. The response, when it comes, is dismissive.
He asks to be remembered, to not be forgotten. He was already forgotten. Picture him in those final months, 70 years old, his body failing, his legs so swollen with gout that he can barely hobble from his desk to his bed, his eyes, weakened by decades of reading and writing by insufficient light, struggle to focus on the pages before him. His rooms in Hanover are cluttered with papers, manuscripts, correspondence, notes for projects he'll never complete. He's still working because work is all he has left. He drafts letters that may never be answered. He revises philosophical treatises that may never be published. He continues the genealogical research because what else can he do? He's alone. His closest friends are dead or distant. His family, he never married, never had children, is scattered or estranged. The dukes he served care nothing for him. The king he helped create has discarded him. The Royal Society treats him as a pariah. Even the universities, which should have celebrated him, are silent. And through it all, his mind, that magnificent, terrible mind, continues working. He can't stop thinking, can't stop seeing connections, can't stop generating ideas. But now those ideas have nowhere to go. He's writing for a future that may never come, hoping against hope that somehow someone will eventually understand. On November 14, 1716, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz died. His secretary was with him, perhaps a servant or two. That was all. No dignitaries, no representatives from the court, no scientific colleagues come to pay their respects. He died as he had lived those final years, alone. The funeral was a farce. No one of importance attended. The court sent no official representatives, even though Leibniz had served the House of Hanover for 40 years. The pastor who conducted the service barely knew him. He was buried in an unmarked grave, as if he were some anonymous clerk whose passing merited no notice. The Royal Society of London, when informed of his death, chose not to record it in their official proceedings. Think about that. A fellow of the Royal Society, one of the most accomplished scientists and mathematicians of the age, dies, and the society simply says nothing. It's as if they were trying to erase him retroactively, to make it seem he'd never existed. Isaac Newton, when told of Leibniz's death, is reported to have shown no emotion whatsoever. No relief, no regret, no acknowledgement that a great mind had been extinguished. Just nothing. His rival was gone, and Newton apparently felt that was exactly as it should be. In the weeks and months after Leibniz's death, there was almost no public acknowledgement of what the world had lost. A few small notices in scholarly journals, a few letters of condolence exchanged between his remaining correspondents, but no great outpouring of grief, no sense that something irreplaceable had vanished from the world. If the story ended there, it would be pure tragedy, unbearable in its injustice. But something remarkable happened in the decades and centuries after Leibniz's death, something that transforms this from a story of unrelieved darkness into something more complex, more redemptive, more ultimately hopeful. The vindication began almost immediately, though Leibniz wasn't there to see it. Continental mathematicians, particularly in France, Germany, and Switzerland, continued developing calculus using Leibniz's notation. And they discovered something that Newton's English followers, stubbornly clinging to his notation, learned much more slowly. Leibniz's notation, the dx, the dy, the integral sign, the whole system of symbols he had crafted so carefully, was flexible, intuitive, powerful. It revealed the structure of the mathematics in a way that made new discoveries possible. It was a tool for thinking, not just for calculation. By the mid-1700s, the divergence was clear. Continental mathematicians, using Leibniz's notation and methods, were racing ahead, making discoveries and solving problems that English mathematicians, hobbled by Newton's inferior notation, simply couldn't match. English mathematics fell behind for nearly a century because of nationalistic loyalty to Newton's system. Eventually, even English mathematicians had to admit defeat. By the early 1800s, everyone was using Leibniz's notation. Newton's fluxions were abandoned, relegated to historical footnotes. When you learned calculus in school, every symbol you wrote, the dx, the dy, the integral sign, was Leibniz's invention. His notation had won completely and permanently. But the vindication went deeper than notation. As scholars began carefully examining the historical record of the calculus dispute, they looked at Newton's and Leibniz's papers, compared their methods, traced their development, and the conclusion became increasingly clear. Both men had invented calculus independently. Newton had been first in time. He'd developed his basic methods in the 1660s, while Leibniz was still learning advanced mathematics in the 1670s. But Leibniz was first to publish, first to create a systematic approach, first to develop notation that made the methods widely accessible. There was no plagiarism, no theft, just two geniuses working independently, reaching the same profound truths through different paths. Modern scholars recognize this. The calculus dispute is now seen as one of the uglier episodes in scientific history, a case where nationalism and personal ego corrupted the search for truth. Newton, whose scientific achievements were genuine and monumental, is now acknowledged to have behaved shamefully in the priority dispute. Leibniz, who died branded as a plagiarist, is now honored as an independent inventor whose contributions were equal to or greater than Newton's. But the rehabilitation went even further. As scholars began seriously studying Leibniz's other work, the papers and manuscripts left moldering in the Hanover archives, they discovered just how far ahead of his time he had been.
His binary arithmetic, dismissed as a curiosity in his lifetime, became the foundation of computer science. Every digital device ever created uses the binary system Leibniz developed. His calculating machines, which he'd built and demonstrated, but which had been largely forgotten, turned out to be the ancestors of modern computers. He'd understood, centuries early, the principles of mechanical computation. His work in formal logic, particularly his dream of a universal characteristic that could express all thought in symbolic form, anticipated the development of mathematical logic by Boole, Frege, and Russell in the 1800s. Bertrand Russell would later say that Leibniz deserved to be considered the founder of mathematical logic. His philosophy, which had been overshadowed by competing systems during his lifetime, became increasingly influential. Kant engaged deeply with Leibniz's ideas. Hegel drew on his work. Modern process philosophy and the philosophy of mind continued to find resources in his writings. His theodicy, that attempt to reconcile divine goodness with worldly evil, remains a central text in philosophy of religion. His work in geology, linguistics, physics, in field after field, scholars discovered that Leibniz had anticipated later developments, had asked questions and proposed answers that wouldn't be fully appreciated until centuries after his death. The man died thinking himself a failure, his work dismissed or stolen, his contributions forgotten. In reality, he had scattered seeds that would grow into entire forests of knowledge. Today, there are monuments to Leibniz across Germany. The Leibniz University Hanover bears his name. The Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz Prize is Germany's most prestigious research award. There are Leibniz Institutes, Leibniz Medals, Leibniz Societies. In Leipzig, a magnificent statue shows him in scholarly robes, books at his feet, his gaze directed upward as if contemplating infinity. The Royal Society of London, which had ignored his death, now celebrates him as one of the giants in their history. The calculus is taught worldwide using his notation. Computer scientists honor him as a forefather of their discipline. Philosophers study his work alongside Descartes, Spinoza, Locke, and Hume as one of the essential voices of the Enlightenment. He has been vindicated completely, permanently, overwhelmingly.
History's verdict has reversed everything that happened in his lifetime. But here's what breaks my heart. None of this would have mattered to the old man dying alone in Hanover in 1716. What would have mattered? A word of kindness from the king he'd served, a fair hearing in the calculus dispute, a colleague stopping by to discuss ideas, a letter acknowledging that his work had value. Recognition not from distant posterity, but from the people around him when it could have eased his suffering. We failed him. Not we personally, of course, we weren't there, but humanity failed him. The scientific institutions failed him. The political patrons failed him. The universities failed him. We took a mind of transcendent brilliance and condemned it to isolation, bitterness, and neglect. And here's the most painful question his story forces us to confront. How many others? How many other Leibnizes have we failed? How many geniuses have died unknown because they lacked the right connections, or made enemies of powerful people, or were simply born in the wrong place at the wrong time? How much has humanity lost because we didn't nurture and protect those rare minds capable of transforming our understanding? Leibniz's story asks us to look around at our own time. Who are we neglecting? Who are we dismissing? What brilliant young person is being told they're too young, or too radical, or too different? What lone researcher, working in obscurity, is making discoveries that won't be recognized until they're dead? What genius are we right now in the process of failing? Because genius isn't enough, vision isn't enough, even changing the world isn't enough. Not if you're unlucky in your circumstances, not if you threaten the wrong people, not if you're trapped in situations beyond your control. Leibniz needed more than intelligence. He needed support, community, recognition, justice. He needed the world to care. And the world didn't care, not when it mattered, not when he was alive and suffering and desperately lonely. There's a letter Leibniz wrote near the very end of his life that I can barely read without tears. He's responding to a young mathematician who had written praising his work. Leibniz, 70 years old, in pain, abandoned by his patrons, slandered by his enemies, writes, "I cannot say what an extraordinary pleasure it gives me when I find that other people have also discovered things which I have found, or something analogous to them. The fact is, I care not at all whether it is I or others who bring to light what truth demands should be made manifest. I prefer to have others anticipate me in discoveries, rather than to claim everything for myself." Read that again. This man, accused of plagiarism, his life's work claimed as stolen, his reputation destroyed by charges that he was a fraud and a thief, still believed in the collaborative nature of knowledge, still found joy in others making discoveries, still valued truth over priority, understanding over credit, the advancement of human knowledge over personal glory. That's the real tragedy. Not just that Leibniz suffered, but that someone with such generosity of spirit, such devotion to truth, such genuine love for knowledge itself, was treated with such casual, careless cruelty by the very world that should have cherished him most. What do we owe to genius? What do we owe to those rare individuals who can see farther than the rest of us, who can imagine possibilities we can't conceive, who can create tools and ideas that transform human capability? We owe them support. We owe them recognition. We owe them community. We owe them justice. We owe them the chance to do their work without being crushed by pettiness, jealousy, and political machination. We failed Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in all of these obligations. We failed him thoroughly, systematically, completely. And then, centuries too late, when it could no longer possibly matter to him, we built him monuments and spoke his name with reverence and used his notation in classrooms around the world. The monuments are beautiful, the recognition is genuine, the influence is undeniable. But none of it brings back the years of loneliness. None of it heals the wounds of betrayal. None of it gives him back the life he should have had, surrounded by colleagues who understood him, supported by patrons who valued his work, honored by institutions that recognized his genius. His death should haunt us. That image of the old man dying alone, attended only by his secretary, unmourned by the world he'd enriched, should burn itself into our collective memory. Not as historical curiosity, not as tragic anecdote, but as warning and challenge. Don't let it happen again. Don't let genius die alone and forgotten. Don't let political convenience or institutional jealousy or personal rivalry destroy those who expand human understanding. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz died on November 14, 1916, alone in a room in Hanover, thinking the world had forgotten him. The world hadn't forgotten, it had never truly known him. But we know him now. We use his inventions daily. We build on his ideas constantly. We stand on his shoulders, whether we realize it or not. The least we can do is remember how he died, and resolved to do better. Because somewhere right now there is another Leibniz, another lonely genius, struggling in obscurity, creating things the world doesn't yet understand, hoping desperately for recognition that may never come in time. What will we do for them? Will we fail them as we failed Leibniz? Or will we finally learn that genius, once extinguished, can never be rekindled, and that the light we allow to go out alone diminishes us all?